Good afternoon and welcome to Session 5 of the Social Isolation and Loneliness series, Effective Approaches for Reducing Loneliness in Nursing Home Residents. The Wellbeing Tree, or Teaching Resilience to Empower Elders Learning and Action Network, is brought to you by Altarum with grant funding from the Michigan Health Endowment Fund. Altarum is a nonprofit headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and has existed for nearly 80 years. We help federal and state health agencies and foundations improve health equity and outcomes. Through better systems of care for lower income children and nursing home eligible older adults, our mission is to help those whose health is negatively impacted by social determinants. My name is Colleen Quintel, and I'll be moderating today's session with my magnificent teammates, Christy, Bethany, Ann, Alex, Allison, and Holly. The Wellbeing Tree Collaborative Learning Platform has provided Michigan nursing homes with tailored learning to better recognize and implement evidence-based strategies to create healthier homes in Michigan. This Learning in Action network is focused on improving social isolation, loneliness, bereavement, and grief conditions. Thank you for joining us today. During the first 6 sessions of the Wellbeing Tree Land, Dr. Tony Miles spoke to us about grief and bereavement. We then had the Eden Alternative present 3 sessions on social isolation and loneliness. And today we have the immense privilege to share with you Dr. Maureen Mikas. On June 27th, she engaged participants during her Tackling Loneliness and Promoting Social Connections Among Nursing Home Residents presentation. Today, she will conclude our Social Isolation and Loneliness series by providing practical approaches for reducing loneliness for nursing home residents. Beyond being an amazing individual, Dr. Mikas is a gerontologist, a professor at Western Michigan University, and a recognized speaker on loneliness in older adults. During her career, she has conducted a vast amount of research on social isolation for individuals in later life, including the use of technology. Her lifelong passion relates to issues about older persons. She is committed to finding ways in which society can create an inclusive world for those with Alzheimer's disease and establish effective and enduring support for marginalized elders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mikas.
Colleen, thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction. Really very much appreciate that. And I want to thank you all for taking time today to be part of this webinar. I know that you all lead very busy lives. If you're working in a nursing facility, it's not a time that you can sit back and put your feet up. It's a time that you're probably on all the time. And so I thank you for taking time to be part of this, and also for the enormously important work that you do as long-term care staff. It's hard work, it's heartfelt work, and it's very much appreciated by so many people. So thank you for being part of this today from the very busy lives that you lead. So I understand from the Altarum team that there were a number of you that were at my initial presentation back in June, where I outlined aspects of loneliness, what it is, definitions, comparing and contrasting that to social isolation. But I know there's a few of you that weren't there. And so I want to just in this one quick slide recap what we covered in that first session. The first point that I want to make is that we see loneliness as a very, very painful emotion, an emotional condition that's associated with feeling alone, feeling very much alone in the world. We know that social isolation can overlap with this feeling of isolation, being physically isolated from that standpoint has some relationship to loneliness. We see these two as related, but they don't necessarily, you could be a standalone. So I could live in a very isolated part of the world and not necessarily feel lonely. Or as all of you know, you're in a facility with many, many people swirling about, and there's still what we believe, and I'll talk about later, a high degree of loneliness. So where social isolation and loneliness often overlap, there are instances where they are standalone concepts, or as we say in the research world, constructs. I want to share with you that we believe that loneliness is widespread in long-term care facilities. That's something that most people have come to believe and accept and even see, witness as you do in your daily work. But one of the things that I want to share with you that I talked about in the presentation last time is that the data that we have, the research that's available for loneliness in nursing homes is predominantly focused on individuals without dementia. And I know you all recognize the high prevalence of dementia. In some instances, we believe is as high as 75 to 80% of long-term care residents have some kind of a cognitive disorder. And so it's difficult for us to, have a clear and perhaps accurate count of loneliness among this subpopulation, which is really the majority of residents served in these facilities. And lastly, I just want to point out to you who were not able to attend the first session that I went through a range of studies illustrating why chronic loneliness is such a serious condition that we should all pay attention to. I laid out some of the studies that indicated that it is a risk factor and very much tied to dementia, premature death, and even suicide, as well as depression, higher blood pressure, a whole range of cardiovascular events that we see tied to loneliness. And I did put here in italics chronic loneliness. So I do want to point out before we get started, this talk is about chronic loneliness. So I think anyone is part of the human experience that we've all experienced, the human condition, let me say, we've all experienced loneliness at some point in our life. It might have been a couple days, it might have been a couple hours, it might have been a couple weeks. We're talking about something very different here. We're talking about chronic loneliness that is unabating. So this is the group of individuals who are experiencing chronic loneliness, this painful emotion that doesn't go away, is the group that we really need to give some thought to and figure out some ways how we can address the situation. So the learning objectives for today, first of all, I want to have us all think about what are the challenges for even thinking about loneliness and social isolation in long-term care. And those of you that were at the first session would have heard me say a number of years back when I asked a geriatric psychiatrist colleague of mine why she doesn't assess loneliness in her patient populations. She very simply said to me, I wouldn't know what to do about it. I don't know how to address loneliness. That was 20 years ago. We've come a long way from that time point, and we can think about loneliness in specific ways that we can address that in the residents that we see. Secondly, speaking of addressing loneliness, I want to explore strategies, especially those using technology, things that have been supported by research to actually prevent, if not reduce loneliness, alleviate loneliness among the residents that you serve. And lastly, as part of that, not just technology, but a few unconventional approaches that maybe you've never considered before, but that we have some emerging evidence to support the use of those approaches. So those would be the three objectives I hope to accomplish in this talk. So as I laid out earlier, the purpose of this talk is for taking action. So just to make it clear that loneliness will result in adverse outcomes for individuals, whether it's residents or our own lives. And we're at the point now that we need to start thinking about how do we move to the next phase and figure out some ways to intervene. What can we all do? What can you do as staff, very important staff at the facility? What kind of catalyst might you be to take action? So the last presentation that I gave, I showed a short video of a young man who was involved in a social experiment in England, and he lived alone. He was expected to stay alone in his apartment for an entire week without any contact whatsoever with the outside world. And if you remember that, if you saw that video, a project called Project Loneliness, he emerged from that week-long isolation pretty distressed. And he went next door to his neighbor, a man named Barry, and he asked him, and it was really devastating for me, be this young man and not have contact with the outside world for an entire week. I mean, he asked him, what could we do? And the older man said, by the way, the older man had been recently bereaved. He was a widow. And he said, the first thing and maybe the most important thing that you can do, and let me say by extension that all of us can do, is just be aware. Just be mindful that loneliness is a condition that's very painful for people, and pay attention to people, and just add that to your list of things that you need to think about, is that person doing okay from a social connection, loneliness, isolation standpoint? Improve awareness. The second thing is you are all working in a built environment that certainly is different depending which part of the state you're in, what your facility, if it's small, large, has multiple wings. We all are working in different physical built environments. And so one thing to ask is, how can we look at our built environment and create a more positive social connections? For example, could we arrange chairs in smaller groups rather than one big multi-purpose room when everyone is expected to participate? Create spaces that may even look like little cafes or small little activity rooms. For many years, I've taken students to Ireland and Northern Ireland as part of an experience to understand aging in a different culture. And we often visit a home just a little bit north of Dublin. It was the award-winning nursing home for the country, actually, for Ireland. And one of the things that they do, they've spent a lot of time just thinking about the space and how do people move about the space. And they've given staff an opportunity to just sit in a part of the facility and say, do people come here? How do they get to this place? Is it a place for conversation? Is it a place that people have a hard time getting to? So thinking about the space where you all operate, where you all work every day, is that conducive to alleviating loneliness and creating these important social connections?
That we'd like to hear from you about aspects of the physical layout of your facility that encourage or discourage feelings of loneliness.
So Kayla says Blossom Cafe for gathering kind of in a common area. Thank you, Kayla. See, Lori says their facility is kind of broken up and there's not open space except for the activity room. Lori, are there any lounges in addition to the activity room, or do you guys just have the activity room? Okay, Emmy, you've got a piano in your lounge. Emmy, do people gather around the piano? Let's see, large dining areas, Heather says. Activities that are smaller so that the guests can utilize. Yes, but let's see, Lori says yes, but it's too small. Emmy says sometimes people gather around the piano. Rachel says they also have kind of a bistro area where families can order. Oh, that's kind of nice. Families can order food and drink and visit with their loved ones in a casual setting. Holly says in her dad's place they had an outdoor area with tables and a gazebo. So we hadn't been talking about we have been talking about inside, and that's an outside area. Or what about outside areas? Let's see, 3 different common areas that residents and their families can sit in during the day. They've got a piano in their dining area that residents enjoy. So that's at least 3 facilities that have pianos. Let's see, we've got living centers on each floor to gather, a large community room for large group activities. Nice. Let's see, Whitney says they've got multiple units that they get together for activities so that the residents can have more opportunities to socialize. Very nice. Rachel says, so from an outside standpoint, they've got a front porch with benches where people can gather. Very nice.
So thank you so much for reading those. I think one of the keys, in addition to the comments that Christy read, is to make this as home-like as possible and, as less institutional and more home-like. And someone said, I think there was a comment about like the person's home and, where do you gather in your own home, and where, when company or when visitors come to your home, where is the most comforting place for people to go? Is it the kitchen table? Is it the living room? Is it a family room? Is it a porch? And so trying to find a way to create those spaces that people will go there even on their own accord, not just staff bringing them there, but they're drawn to those places. So perhaps some more attention to what does the physical space look like and how can we encourage more social connections in those areas? Thank you for that discussion. So the next thing I want to talk about is how do we enhance connections? One of the things that's really, I think, very clear for those working in aging is that friendships are very, very important in later life, but it's difficult to make new friends as we grow older. So we know that friends very much contribute to our quality of life as we age, but think about the time when you were in kindergarten, how many friends you had. Those friends may have only lasted a few weeks, but those friendships were quite abundant. As we get older people have less opportunities to make new friends. And so one of the things that's important is how do we help older people keep the friendships that they have, maintain those friendships, and possibly improve those friendships. And it's certainly still possible for individuals to make new connections. I think sometimes families have a grand expectation that my mother is being placed in a facility, she's being admitted to a facility, and she's going to be surrounded by lots of people her own age. It's not that easy for individuals to connect with individuals that they didn't know before. So how do we help them make those connections? As well as the third bullet that I have here, help them change their thinking about social connections. So a colleague of mine at Michigan State University years ago, a psychologist said, when she knew I was interested in loneliness and social isolation, she said, Maureen, maybe the trick is to help people be more, I'm going to make up a word here, but hopefully you'll understand, visitable. So, when adult children, for example, come to visit, how do you make that visit, more engaging, not just for the resident, but how do you help the resident perhaps make it more engaging for the visitors themselves? So they'll want to come back. They'll want to keep that social connection strong. That said, I don't want to overstate this idea of social connections, because sometimes it can be really hard in cases with family estrangement. So, in cases of dysfunction, whether it's with family or really quite honestly with friends, I'm sure we've all known someone who is no longer speaking to perhaps their only daughter, their only son, or they had a sister and somehow they cut off ties with that person. And that's really, really difficult, because again, we're not piling on lots and lots of new friendships as we get older. So it's important for us to maintain what we have, as well as, even if possible, reestablish those important relationships in some cases. So those examples of family estrangement, they may have come because maybe something very small occurred and somebody got upset and they never really resolved that. Or maybe it was something even more serious. Some common factors that we know relate to breakdown in these relationships, especially with parents, siblings, and adult children. There may have been emotional abuse. There may have been substance abuse, a clash of personalities, values, conservative values, more liberal values, people really breaking relationships over these issues, mismatched expectations about what is your responsibility in the family, what does that relationship look like to you, and it may not be shared with the other party. So some very key and common areas that have caused some of the residents that you serve that have family members, but those ties have been severed. So I want to now move on to this idea about personal preferences. One of the things that we know very clearly from the research is that people have personal preferences about who they are. And we say person-centered care, not in the sense of just that's lovely rhetoric to put on the table, but what does it mean to have person-centered care offered at your facility? In part, that has to mean, in my opinion, it has to mean that you know who the person is. You know what's meaningful to them. You know what is fulfilling to them, not just who they are now, but especially in the case of cognitive disorders, what were the preferences and who was that person before they came to the facility, before the dementia progressed in their lives. I really enjoyed animals, but I'm not in the position anymore to own a pet. But you should know that about me. You should know that I really love dogs, and you should know that that's something that brings joy and happiness to me, and that can be a point of connecting me to other people who share similar preferences in their lives related to recreation in particular, because we believe those are ways, understanding those personal preferences can help us alleviate loneliness. But let me just come back to talk about the ways of helping reestablish connections with family members. One thing that you can do as staff is perhaps not use guilt. Guilt rarely is a very effective weapon in many things in this world. So making adult children feel less likely, making them feel guilty. Gosh, your mom's really lonely. She could very much benefit from you coming to visit her. It's probably not going to do much in the way of increasing those visits. In fact, it might make it such that that adult child may be less likely to come. Helping the older adult, this comes back to my idea of visitability, helping the older adult learn how to be a better visitor. So when the adult child comes, or the sibling comes, or a friend comes, not just talk about your life in the nursing home, but help the resident understand, maybe it would be great if you could ask, how is your adult child's, how's work going? Tell me if you've still been keeping up with your hobbies, showing some interest and engagement and concern related to their lives. An individual could express writing or even with a recording that staff could help with, showing thankfulness to one's family. And even talking about happy experiences, even if there's been some negative experiences that have occurred more recently, but to maybe reflect back on things that really were very positive in their lives and their relationship with their loved ones. And then, if possible, even though this can be very difficult, helping the older person come to a point of forgiveness, to have the older person seek forgiveness that they may have been the responsible party, or just finding a way to bring the groups together and find a way for reconciliation. I now want to talk, as we're talking about personal preferences and how do people come together for activities, I want you to think for a moment about this question with large groups. How do large groups actually contribute? How might it be a factor that actually increases loneliness and the residents you serve? So think about some of the big groups that are offered in facilities, a large exercise group with 20 people, a bingo game with 30 people, whatever it might be. What might be some ways that we think about large groups in a way that is not necessarily helping us feel connected to other people? In your facility, large groups, is it possible that those large groups, for some individuals, not for all, might contribute to greater loneliness?
Do your facilities have smaller, like one-on-one or 2 or 3 people type activities where it isn't as large, or is it always kind of a free for all and it's an activity that and everybody can join if they want to, but if they don't have to, but it's not necessarily something specified that it's a smaller? As an activity director, do you go grab just 2 or 3 people to participate in an activity versus we know that every Wednesday, as Maureen said, it's bingo or that it's church service or that it's crafts? Do you do smaller groups?
So Anne's pointing out something really important here with respect to sensory deficit, sensory difficulties. If I have a difficult time hearing, for example, it's not necessarily a comforting or even, a comforting, it's certainly not going to help me feel connected to other people when I'm in a large group. It doesn't necessarily help that. Only those cognizant and physically able to participate, so you're leaving other people behind. Lynn wrote, we've been doing small sensory group things in groups of 5 or 7. Because people were getting lost in large groups. So those seem like very, very practical and important ideas that you're putting out. So, I think just the main idea here is that not everything, all activities fit all persons. So people who really enjoy large groups should continue on with those large groups. But for us to be mindful and aware, just to be mindful that some people will not flourish in those situations and they need a different kind of a setup. Large group settings aren't always conducive to getting to know each other on a more personal level. And I think that's spot on. So I want to talk about some effective interventions that we know from the research literature. This is a Venn diagram that you see, in a couple of these points I've already touched on. Focus on shared interests. So you need to know what my preferences are. You need to know that I like animals and I like dogs. Oh, someone, by the way, wrote, I want to just make a quick note about this. Rachel wrote about men's groups. Don't want to hang out with a bunch of old ladies. If any of you have an opportunity to Google men's sheds, there are hundreds and hundreds of men's sheds in Europe that have been very effective in addressing the needs of older men, specifically to help older men connect with other men around some meaningful task, making things with their hands in many cases. So thank you for bringing that up, Rachel. I think that's a really important point, that we don't forget about special needs of certain populations, including men. But coming back to this slide, we want to look at shared interests. We want to find things that, not just throwing people together in a group, but like who's interested in what and how can we pair people together? Now we start finding connections. Now I have something to talk with you about. You like dogs, you had a dog, let's talk about dogs. I think having this idea of older people running the group is very, very powerful. Coming back to this idea of men's sheds, which I mentioned earlier, those groups are almost exclusively run by the men themselves. So think about the residents you have in your facility. Do they have cooking skills? Do they have have they traveled somewhere that they'd like to share? Giving them more of a leadership role and running the group and teaching other people a skill or a craft or something. Do they know another language? Lots of opportunities that older adults have a lifetime experience, that giving them an opportunity to share. And we have a few in the US, probably less than you would expect, but there's hundreds and hundreds of these in Australia and Europe. So thank you for sharing that, Colleen, more information about men's sheds. I want to now turn and talk about technology. I think we often turn to technology as a way to alleviate loneliness, especially if someone is socially isolated or someone is not connected well with other people, say in the facility. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into this and show you what the research says about technology, which is relatively new on the front. It really came to a head, obviously, during COVID when video conferencing was probably very much a part of what went on in your facility. This is a result of a systematic review, which is one of the highest levels of research evidence from a database called the Cochrane Library. Cochrane Library, very well respected database for research. And this was done quite recently in the past couple of years. And they looked to see a wide set of studies to say, what do we know about video calls, video conferencing, and did it actually reduce social isolation and loneliness? And there were a range of what we say methodological issues with this, asking this question of how people define loneliness, what the groups look like, how long did they do the study. And at the end, one of the conclusions was the use of technology to reduce loneliness is still very new. It's not something we've used for a long time in long-term care. And therefore, let me just say the jury is still out. So the research is uncertain about to what degree is loneliness alleviated by the use of video calls, which again, many of you used during the pandemic. If you were working in that position in the pandemic, I'm fairly certain you would have been involved with arranging video conferencing for residents and their families. That said, I want to share just a few studies where it does appear to have some potential, some areas where it may be a promising opportunity for us to explore further. So this is a study that was done in Taiwan. The older adults in the facility interacted with their family members once a week for 6 months. So quite a long study. They only used a smartphone for this, probably a communication app like FaceTime. And they did have a control group, and we know that always strengthens the study. This was done in 2020. So again, a fairly recent study. And what they concluded that those using the video conferencing reported less pain, less loneliness, and improved physical health. Did not necessarily impact depressive symptoms, but it did have an impact on alleviating loneliness. This is another study also done in 2020. Residents who were more satisfied with the use of video calls, so video conferencing, Zoom, WebEx, Google Meet, and so forth, to communicate with their relatives. 93% said they were satisfied versus the use of telephone calls when provided they were given assistance to establish communication, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but also very positive results of that particular study. And this is not necessarily a study, it's more of an anecdotal report where a facility, the Porter Medical Center, referring to video conferencing, as you see with a small iPad in front or a computer tablet in front of the resident, saying this is miracle technology. With video chats, the quote says, with video chats, seniors have to be active listeners. They converse, share ideas, and their participation is encouraged. These miracle video chats have changed us forever. So quite a large claim that they're making to the value of technology. But for this particular facility, it did seem to be effective. But I want to turn for just a moment and consider technology and what's tailored for an older person, because technology, first of all, it can mean many things, everything from, you heard, from a telephone to even more high tech, such as virtual reality. But what does it mean to use technology for purposes of reducing loneliness, specifically for older persons? As I said in one of the objectives, I want to talk about these challenges that come along with the use of technology. And some of the barriers are very real, and they're very important as far as having an older adult successfully use technology for purposes of social connections. Some of these you see on the left: staff turnover. Not older people are not all, some of them are very averse to using technology. It's not something part of their daily lives. So this can be a scary thing. They're afraid that they're going to break it or something's going to go wrong. What does the intervention design look like? How many times are people expected to have these points of communication? You have to have a family commitment. Some of your residents don't have any family members, which is obviously very unfortunate. Is there somebody else that could be connected, perhaps a friend? But we need to have another person on the other side. I want to say something about the staff. You all work very, very busy lives. Staff turnover is real. I know long-term care has long had a challenge for many, many decades, finding enough people to work in your facilities. And so the question is, do people have time to help people get set up with these important social connections using technology. Here's some quotes from staff themselves who said, the app stopped working and the call got cut off. I couldn't make a connection to call back, and she became really anxious and upset. She was thinking that her family wasn't picking up, and I had to calm her down. So obviously a downside and negative to using technology, despite some of the promising reports you heard a minute ago. Another person said, it's hard for me. Other staff here are really busy, and if they don't really know how to use this, they won't bother much. It's too much to have to learn while they're doing other things, such as personal care tasks of, grooming and toileting and all the myriad of things that staff are expected to do in long-term care. So, here's one of the barriers to implementing technology in your facilities. So we have another question we'd like to ask.
We'd like to ask everyone to share other challenges residents might encounter regarding technology in the chat box.
You guys have examples over the last couple of years where you've used tablets or smartphones or computers and things that have transpired, examples of either challenges or, for that matter, good things too. If anybody has an example of something cool that transpired. Do all of you have tablets for residents? Do some of you have tablets and not all of you? Who has tablets for resident use? And or if you don't have tablets, if you're not using tablet, okay, so Kelly, you've got tablets. If you don't have tablets, does anybody have like a single computer that so the activity department, okay, Rachel says the activity department has tablets.
Do a lot of your residents have their own smartphone that they can use?
Mostly accessibility, or having the same platform for video calls, and at times they don't answer. Let's say a resident calls the family at times that they don't answer. Okay, so I guess that would be problematic. Let's see, Jody says they've got iPad. Headphones are huge in terms of needing to have them, Lynn, or the actual description of your headphones, meaning they make a difference to help people hear.
Basically, like having like the nice headphones and the ones that go over the top or something so they can have either video calls or interact on stuff. It's huge, because like if they have that where they're in their own space where they're not being disrupted, I mean, I have a hard time talking on the phone because I mean everybody's busy everywhere. It helps cut down on distraction, kind of put everything in the frame to where they can see what they're doing and they're totally involved. But yeah, we've had a bunch of different ones that we use and clean, and we turn them out because it's like if you don't have them, it's a whole different interaction.
That makes sense. It definitely makes sense. Thank you very much. And let's see, Lori said that they had a resident from Germany that hadn't been able to visit her country in years, and they were able to show her on the computer her hometown, and she was able to talk about stories from the past. That's a cool way to use technology to engage somebody. So let's see, Rachel said most of our alert residents do have smartphones. Very helpful.
I wanted to say just a comment about Lori's. I'm actually starting a research study this fall. I'm calling virtual reality travel therapy, where using an app called Google Wander, you can take this resident from Germany to have a very immersive experience going to any place. It could be somewhere, a childhood home, not just Europe, but anywhere. We're hoping will be a positive experience for residents. But I think a couple of you are alluding to the idea that this works well for people who are doing well from a cognitive standpoint, but I've also heard at least anecdotes from individuals working in long-term care that it was very confusing to see my daughter up on the screen. I'm in the facility and I don't understand why my daughter can't just come in the room with me. And so, if one is too far progressed with dementia or other cognitive difficulties, this idea of using technology and why am I seeing my daughter here? Why isn't she in the room? As I think you even heard from that one example, can be upsetting to someone. So we have to be careful that people are able to understand technology and it's not an upsetting experience for them. I wanted to show some less conventional, but also considered effective approaches. So some of you in your facility either have animals that are resident dogs and cats, or you have hopefully pet therapy that comes in and brings animals to visit with residents. We know there's a fair amount of literature that suggests that animals help us feel better and help us connect to other people. So dog companionship, for example, gives residents something to talk about. This is dog companionship provided to residents 3 times a week for 90 minutes, so a very strict protocol. Significantly reduced the ideas, the feelings of loneliness in this study from 2013. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Paro before. Paro's been around for a while, is originally developed in Japan personal assistive robots. Let me just say as a sidebar, these are they were about $6,000. So I'm guessing you don't have a whole closet full of Paro, but these are small baby seals and they're very, very interactive. Use of Paro indicated significant decline in depression and loneliness over time in long-term care residents. I met the developers of Paro at an aging conference, at a gerontology conference a number of years ago. I said, why has this not been developed as a dog or a cat? And they explained to me that there are individuals in this world who are afraid of dogs and they're afraid of cats. And so that doesn't represent a comforting animal for them to hold and snuggle. And so apparently none of us are afraid of baby seals. So they developed this robot as a baby seal, and they found great success in using Paro in facilities. But for your facilities who cannot afford a $6,000 Paro, we have another option that's not quite as interactive, but also quite, I think, impressive in the way of reducing loneliness and increasing happiness in your residents. And maybe some of you have these in your facilities. So I'm going to show you just a short video clip what this looks like.
A casual look and a quick listen, and you'd think this is a pretty affectionate kitty.
He's saying hello to you.
This is actually an amazingly realistic robot. The kitty purrs, blinks, rubs his face, and even rolls over. But that's not the most remarkable part. It's the effect this robotic pet has on the residents in the memory care unit at the Hebrew Home in Riverdale. All of these folks have varying degrees of Alzheimer's or other dementias.
Makes me happy. I'm very happy. She talks to me. That was a long conversation.
Nancy Trainellis is Justina Lecanfora's daughter. She's not sure whether her mother knows the cat is real or not, but she does know that it has a calming effect on her mom.
With this, I don't see that agitation. She smiles and wants to talk and so content.
Hebrew Home CEO Daniel Reingold says they already had a pet therapy program, but live animals need feeding and cleaning and aren't always around when residents need calming. And the robots give residents something else important.
It even provides an opportunity for the resident to be in the role of the nurturer and the caregiver, which is a very calming kind of experience for them.
Dementia patients can sometimes become agitated and hard to soothe. The robotic cats do that without drugs.
These animals are a wonderful way to use a non-pharmacologic approach to offer comfort and a sense of calm.
And you only have to watch the residents interact with the pets to see their beneficial effect.
She makes me happy.
So far less expensive than Paro. So it looks like some of you are writing on the side that you have some of these. You've got some in your facilities. No litter box cleaning is required. Yes, you have 2 of those cats and the residents love them. So for those of you who are at facilities and have not tried this as an intervention, so obviously it is having an impact for some of the residents on levels of agitation, but it seems like it could also be a way for people to connect. You saw the family member connecting with the resident. It could be residents together sitting with their animals. It's just a natural point of conversation. So I think this has a lot of promise. There's obviously more sophisticated versions of robotic interactions that are available to older persons, not necessarily used frequently in the United States, but here's in the UK, they're using actual that look more, well, not like a person, but they are small robots. I know in Japan and the UK, they're testing out some of these robots where people can just have conversations with them and really provide some social interaction. So here's the study that said residents who interact with robots for up to 18 hours across 2 weeks had a significant improvement in their mental health and reduced severity of loneliness. So cat and dog may not work for everyone, but here we have a more sophisticated version of an actual robot. And lastly, I want to just share, if you look at the literature and you look at the group, shared interests with groups, you look at pets, you look at the range of interventions that I've talked about so far, I want to share just a few more interventions that may possibly surprise you of ways to address some loneliness. One is gardening. What it is about gardening, I couldn't say specifically, but this is again another study in Taiwan with nursing home residents. A gardening program significantly decreased both depression and loneliness, very, very important in older residents in a nursing home in Taiwan. So this idea of being in nature and sharing that possibly with others seems to be an effective approach, has very strong support from the research literature. And lastly, I want to share with you something that you've maybe never considered, laughter therapies. This is a study from 2018. Kuro et al. Demonstrated that twice a week for 5 weeks, resulted in a 50% decrease in loneliness. You may have never heard of laughter therapy, so I want to just share a few examples of what that looks like. This is with perhaps the case mix would be less frail than perhaps some of the residents you see, but perhaps with a population that could really benefit from this. And then we're going to show you a slide with somebody with dementia and how laughter therapy might be one of the areas to consider for reducing loneliness.
Ha, 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 ha.
It's not hard to see why these seniors love laughter yoga.
All right, let's grab our handlebars. We got to start it. Ha.
Leah Tunnell is a laughter yoga instructor at Querencia on Barton Creek. It's a retirement community. And for years, she's been getting senior citizens to break out of their shells.
If I can just get them to stay for 3 classes, they're hooked for life. But the first 3 classes are a little hard because that little voice in your head is going, this is the dumbest thing. You know? But after you do it and you feel the benefit, that's the thing. Paws up, tongues out.
Leah tells us the class was created by an American-trained doctor from India. His method is now being taught across the world and has been praised by many. According to the Mayo Clinic, laughter can help reduce stress by stimulating organs. When you laugh, you increase your intake of oxygen-rich air, which stimulates your heart, lungs, and muscles.
After 10 minutes of laughing, you get endorphins. That's nature's painkiller. After about 10 minutes, you get dopamine. That's the little chemical that gets people hooked on shopping or video games. You know, people get a release of dopamine, so it naturally lightens you up and makes you feel lighter and better.
The breath of yoga is incorporated into class.
Deep breath in and out. Woo, that was mighty good.
But for the most part, the class is very upbeat.
Oh, how would a monkey laugh?
Well, I find that she's so joyful that we are too, and we can share it. We're encouraged to look at each other and not just look at the teacher. And it's fun to see how each member that I know here and live with, how they express their joy.
Oh, it's a hoot, actually, because we look at each other and we smile and we laugh. And there's just something very, very enlightening and very helpful about doing that.
And that's what it's all about, being silly, opening up, and laughing.
I think everybody comes because they know when they leave, they're going to feel better than when they came. If we spend our life all sad, our life's going to be sad. If you practice joy, your life's going to be more joyful. Ho, ho, and ha, ha, ha.
Tanya Ortega, Fox News.
So somewhat unconventional approach, but bring individuals together in a very important way to connect socially. And lastly, I want to share this video with you, which is an individual who is quite progressed in her dementia and a daughter who felt that laughter therapy is something that can really improve the quality of her life. And as part of that, connecting her with other people. So we'll play the last video.
They say laughter is the best medicine, and our next guest, Danny, is making it her mission to use it to help Alzheimer's patients.
The hardest part of witnessing my mother going through this decline is that she still looks like my mother, and when I look in her eyes, I know it's my mother. My mother is 87. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia 7 years ago. She had formerly been a very high-functioning executive, and now it was clear that she needed help. Once I brought my mother here from New York to California, and she realized she wasn't leaving, she became depressed and sad. So I wanted to do something for her, and I had it in my head, oh, I should hire a comedian to cheer her up. So I created Laughter on Call. Laughter on Call is a company that brings comedians to Alzheimer's patients. Even though people with Alzheimer's can't talk and express themselves in the way that's familiar, you can share laughter with them and then you have a connection. Michael is one of the comedians that visits with my mother regularly. It's really a beautiful relationship, and he makes her laugh, and sometimes just what they do is hold hands and they sit together and he gives her some ice cream. Oh, that's it became clear that this was changing my mother's life.
When I come to see Muriel, a big smile lights up on her face, the hand reaches out. It's awesome. Being that Muriel's going through something so extreme, for me, getting that smile, getting that laugh, it makes it so worth it for me.
If it weren't for laughter, I do not think my mother would be alive. She's this beautiful person, and I don't know that enough people see it now because they're too afraid to come, and that makes me cry. That makes me cry. That makes me cry. So that's my gift to her, is I bring people to her.
In this case, 100% laughter is medicine.
Thank you for sharing that. In conclusion, I'm hoping that this has given you some ideas, and maybe if we have a few minutes, we can talk about that. But I want to thank you all for hearing some of the ideas that the research literature offers us in way of how do we address loneliness, other than just saying this is an unfortunate condition for someone in later life, but it is what it is. That's not the case any longer. We have ways, we have ideas, we have strategies, and we have research to document we can do better. I think we had one final question.
Yeah, we were hoping to have a brief discussion about what small or large steps you guys might be able to take to reduce loneliness and isolation in the residents that you serve, things that you might be able to take back and utilize. And I'm curious, is anybody already doing laughter therapy? Is anybody, after watching that, willing to consider doing laughter therapy? We haven't, but it sounds like a fantastic idea. I agree. I mean, let's say you've got joke hour where you can tell jokes to residents. That's kind of nice, LaDonna. Amanda says that she agrees too, that maybe it's something that they can do in their facility. There you go. So Whitney, we're going to send you, Whitney, to get your certification, and then you can, and we're going to have you not just do your facility, but we're going to have you do the rest of the facilities too. Whitney's going to do laughter therapy or laughter yoga for us.
Or invite your grandchildren to read from their joke book.
That's an awesome idea too. Little kids are always funny whether they're telling jokes or not usually. So.
I want to just say, for those of you that were not part of the first session, there's a wonderful, wonderful website, Campaign to End Loneliness. It's actually based in England. It's based in the UK, but it's a clearinghouse for all kinds of ideas, research, all sorts of resources for loneliness. So it's the Campaign to End Loneliness, and it's collecting data, including assessment tools that you might be interested in using. I know some people from the first session were interested in some of the assessment tools that I presented, but Campaign to End Loneliness is a fantastic site if you're interested in tackling this. And I just want to say, as my final comment, I'm hoping that this has been an opportunity for you to consider how important loneliness is. I actually consider it one of the vital signs that we take blood pressure from individuals, we measure their heart rate, but we're somehow forgetting the fact that we're social animals. We need to connect with other people. It's good for our health. It's good for just feeling part of the human race. And so any ways that you can do to help improve social connections and loneliness among the residents you serve is such an important step that you can take. Thank you all so much for your time and attention today. And I thank you for all the great work you're doing in facilities across our state.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mikas. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and throughout the Wellbeing Tree series. All the session recordings and resources are available or will be on our website, altarum.org/WellbeingTRee. Sincere thanks to our knowledgeable and passionate presenters, Dr. Tony Miles, Christy Doan and Chris Angevine with the Eden Alternative, and Dr. Maureen Mikas. Again, the Wellbeing Tree thanks you for all you do to improve the lives of your residents. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.